That's my cue. I used to tell people when asked that I was unchurched as a child. That isn't quite accurate. But for all the time I ever spent inside a church growing up, it is more or less true. My childhood memories of church are as vivid as they are, mostly because they were mercifully infrequent. So what happened at church made a bigger impression upon me because it was out of the ordinary, which is not to be confused with extraordinary. It wasn't. Looking back, I would describe my brief encounters of a churchly kind as a weekend inconvenience. My parents weren't churchgoers themselves, so my siblings and I were taken to church by neighbors until we were old enough to go on our own by bus. As the youngest of four, I was spared the need to make the journey on my own, which meant that my Sunday school career came to an end when my sister, 6 years my senior, was confirmed. What a relief that was, to have my Sundays back, to not have to get dressed up, but to wear whatever I cared to wear on Sunday morning. And most importantly, not to have to break in what seemed like a new young Sunday school teacher almost every Sunday. It was a relief. Even so, my sojourn among the Lutherans was long enough to scandalize a few tender souls with my repertoire at the church picnic, where I accompanied myself on ukulele to a selection of Irish drinking songs and a bawdy ballad or two from Oscar Brand, and to disrupt rehearsals for the Christmas pageant with my advanced knowledge of human reproduction and my father's theories about the paternity of Jesus. Still, I fondly remember Mrs. Honey, the church school superintendent, who was as sweet and as caring as her name suggests. She taught me I was unique, loved, and worthy, just as I am. So I count her influence on my spiritual development to have been a success. The reason that I found myself among the Lutherans in those days was that there was a mission congregation in our neighborhood that met at the St. James YMCA, the last of the Icelandic Lutheran Synod congregations to be formed. And the minister who came to oversee this operation was someone who used to play cards with my great-grandmother. And so she made a special request. And in a family where, well, relationships probably mattered more than faith, we happily toddled off half a mile to the Lutheran congregation before they built a new facility a further 1.5 miles to the west. It did me no harm, but it was a brief experience. So rather than say I was unchurched as a child, which suggests my upbringing was without spiritual content at all, that it was complicated, like the relationship status some like to post on Facebook. With mixed roots, both ethnically and religiously, choices had to be made, and compromises were inevitable. My parents believed that character was measured by how people behaved, not by what religion they professed. And their own convictions focused on ethics rather than belief. I could outline my religious pedigree for you, but it would be as confusing as a genealogical chart. So let me give you the highlights. On the Icelandic side of my family, people were members of the Church of Iceland, but with a curious twist. For the parish they came from was served by a minister who had fallen under the influence of the New England Unitarian William Ellery Channing. And this long predated the establishment of a Unitarian congregation among the Icelanders here. So my family was influenced by Channing Unitarianism while they were still nominally Lutherans, which is one of the reasons, perhaps, that they were so casual with the churches they attended. Another branch of my family adhered to the Labor Church. Some of you have probably never heard of it, but there was a time when there were 8 labor churches here in the city of Winnipeg, from about a year before the general strike, for which we are famous, to about a decade later. One branch of my family attended the Labor Church in Weston, and a great uncle even played on the Labor Church soccer team. This congregation was Unitarian in everything but name. In fact, they copied their practices and their beliefs from Unitarian sources, primarily because the founder of the Labor Church in merry old England was a former Unitarian minister who had lost his faith. And although my father was confirmed as a Lutheran, he already identified as a Unitarian by the time it happened. You see, he was an enthusiastic Boy Scout. And the Lutheran Church in Winnipeg wouldn't sponsor a Boy Scout troop. If you were a youth and you were eligible, you got to attend the Luther League. But Boy Scouts were, well, pagan, if we get right down to it. And so my dad attended the scout troop hosted by First Federated Church, as this congregation was once known. And he was exposed to Unitarian ideas and the ministry of Philip Peterson. During the Second World War, Dad identified as an agnostic, according to his military records. But following the war, he did describe himself as a Unitarian, although he never joined the church. However, he did immerse himself in the writings of leading Unitarian ministers, such as Charles Francis Potter, A. Powell Davies, and Duncan Howlett. Such books lined the shelves of his not insubstantial library, and they, more than what I learned at Lutheran Sunday School, provided the basis for my spiritual development as a youth. Dad's bookshelves were also lined with the works of philosophers and scientists, anthropologists and environmentalists. Instead of Genesis, I was raised on the writings of Rachel Carson. Instead of another part of Genesis, I was raised on the work of Carl Sagan and even the science fiction of Isaac Asimov. These were the basis of my spiritual development. From my father and my grandfather, I learned to love and cherish nature, to appreciate being out in the natural world. From my mother and my grandmothers, I learned important lessons about ethics and about caring for one another and about how to behave in the world. When I look back on it now, I would say that as a youngster, I was spiritually homeschooled. That yes, I was unchurched, but I was homeschooled in spiritual matters. And I like to think that it has served me well as an adult, just as it served me well as a child. Because there were so many Unitarian ministers on my father's bookshelves, after he died, it was natural that I would find myself here, seeking a community of individuals who believed the same sort of things and cherished the same sort of values as the members of this congregation. And so it was a kind of a great replacement theory with a twist that led me to Unitarian Universalism as an active participant and not just someone who, perhaps like Henry David Thoreau, thought Unitarian thoughts while I was lounging around the woods at Walden, or in my case, along the shores of Lake Winnipeg. It was, in fact, a rich spiritual upbringing, even if it was unconventional, and even if it didn't require church school classrooms. In her book, The Sense of Wonder, Rachel Carson wrote, "If I had influence with the good fairy, who is supposed to preside over the christening of all children, I should ask that her gift to each child in the world be a sense of wonder, so indestructible that it would last throughout life, as an unfailing antidote against the boredom and disenchantments of later years, the sterile preoccupation with things that are artificial, the alienation from the sources of our strength." I think that is the gift that I received from my parents as a child. And I sometimes wonder how much easier their work may have been in raising me if they had just, shown up at a Unitarian congregation. Now, I'm not here to sell Unitarianism in particular, but I think it's easier to do some things in community. Hillary Clinton maintained that it took a village to raise a child, and that's as true spiritually as it is materially. It does take a village. The problem for our family was that we were a public transit family before it became ecologically fashionable. And the Unitarian Church was located on a much more difficult path to navigate by bus. And I attribute to that more than anything else why we never made our way to a church that would have been more compatible with my parents' way of being in the world. And I sometimes worry that even this church is too inconveniently located on the bus route for people to find their way here, and that sometimes we need to figure out ways to take ourselves out into the community so that we can sow our values where people may not otherwise hear about us. But as I said, I'm not here to sell Unitarianism. In fact, I'm about to tell you a story that would undermine the very activity. A little over 20 years ago, I was asked to consult with a large Unitarian Universalist congregation on the East Coast, one of the largest. At the time, it boasted about 800 members. And it did have a tiny little connection to us because it shared a minister with us, a minister who left here before the First World War and ended up as minister in this congregation. But that's not strictly relevant to the story. I was going in to work with them on important and weighty matters related to governance and membership growth. They weren't having trouble growing as a congregation. They were having some difficulty managing the growth that they were experiencing. And so it was that in my professional role with the Unitarian Universalist Association, I showed up to offer them advice. I got there, and there were several sessions. They even let me into the pulpit, where I told them about William A. Vroman, who had been minister of this congregation before going to theirs. And it was an enjoyable visit. But on Sunday afternoon, we were meeting with a large group of people about the managing the growth problem they were dealing with. And one young mother expressed her dismay that Unitarian Universalists seemed to be so, incapable of holding on to their own young people. She had read something in the Unitarian Universalist world that pointed out that only a minority of our own children stay around as adults. And this was a problem to her. She had grown up, as I understood it, in a fundamentalist household. And perhaps 3 or 4 years before I was working with this congregation, she had found Unitarian Universalism, which she experienced as being liberating and life-saving. She was enthusiastic about our church, enthusiastic about our children's program in that congregation, and she wanted us to take more seriously the task of holding on to our own young people. She thought that religious education was mostly about indoctrinating our children into our ways of being religious and producing a new generation of Unitarian Universalists. She went on at great length. She was obviously troubled by her experience that we seemed so casual, that we sort of offered Unitarian Universalism, what we professed to be our faith, to our own children as if we were offering them the choice between a cookie or a piece of raisin bread on Sunday morning. She wanted us to be more serious about it, and she was quite vocal. Other parents shook their heads in agreement with her. And a part of me wanted to cheer her on, but another part of me had reservations. And then I looked over at the senior minister of the congregation, a beloved colleague who was one of the most respected members of the Unitarian Universalist ministry. I looked at him and he was obviously uneasy. He spoke up. He shocked everyone by saying, I don't care if our children become Unitarian Universalist adults or not. It doesn't matter to me. He said, that's not what the purpose of our religious exploration programs is. We're not here to indoctrinate the young. We're not here to convert them to our way of understanding religion. We are here to nurture them in their spiritual growth so that they grow into good people. That's enough. He said, if the only thing we produce in our religious exploration programs is good people, we will have accomplished everything that we need to accomplish in the spiritual development of our children. The room went silent. It was a haunting silence. And then he went on. You see, he had been raised in a devout Catholic family. They went to church every Sunday and on the days in between. They maintained daily devotions at the dinner table and at bedtime and when they awakened to greet the day. His parents were faithful members of their local church, and they raised their children to become faithful members of that same church. And my colleague, noting that as a young man he entered seminary to become a priest before he had a change of heart, but that he had found Unitarian Universalism and had gone on to study for our ministry, that he of our congregations as a minister, that he had had a distinguished career in the ministry, that he took liberal religion seriously and it informed his life and guided his actions, that he too maintained daily devotions, albeit of a different sort than his parents, that he was a person who had committed his entire life to the church. He lamented that his parents somehow felt that they had failed in his religious upbringing, and it saddened him. He said, I don't want any of you to feel the way my parents have felt. I want you to look upon your children, whatever paths they choose, and view them with pride, with a sense of accomplishment for the guidance that you have given them growing up. Religious exploration is not about producing cookie cutters of ourselves, but rather instilling whatever sense of the Spirit, whatever sense of ethics, whatever sense of goodness we can help to cultivate. He said, I don't want you to feel like my parents, because I don't want my parents to feel the way they do. They were successful, he said, and whether or not we produce the next generation of Unitarian Universalists, we will be successful if we give our children the care and nurture they deserve. That is enough. Liberal religious education, he said, is about nurturing good, wholesome, healthy, happy people. It's enough. That experience is so vividly imprinted upon my memory, and I have carried it around with me wherever I go, because in that moment, having come to be the instructor, I was instead schooled in a deeper, more profound understanding about what Unitarian Universalist religious exploration is about. In most religious traditions, the purpose of religious education is to transmit the doctrines and practices of the faith from one generation to the next, thereby creating the next generation of the faithful. Our goal isn't to create new members, although it is nice when it happens, but rather to instill wholesome values and grow healthy individuals. My colleague was channeling William Ellery Channing that day, and it occurred to me that whether they knew it or not, my parents were channeling William Ellery Channing with my spiritual development. The great end in religious instruction, he said, is not to stamp our minds upon the young, but to stir up their own, not to make them see with our eyes, but to look inquiringly and steadily with their own, not to give them a definite amount of knowledge, but to inspire a fervent love of truth. And by so doing, we will not impose upon them arbitrary rules or unreasonable expectations, but rather awaken the conscience and invite them to moral discernment. The great end in religious education, said Channing, is to awaken the soul, to excite and cherish spiritual life. May the children who come here through every generation, may the children who find spiritual nurture in this place and among this people find themselves awakened to new realities, new possibility, new hope. May we be a place that aspires to awaken the soul in the very young and the very old, to be communities of constant and continuous learning and exploration. For it also remains true that religious exploration is not for the young alone. It is for all of us. Please join in the closing song, number 190, Light of Ages and of Nations.